his Bachelor of Science in Biology and Geology from SUNY Albany. And then he did a Master's of Science at Adelphi University in Biology. He worked with Dr. Christensen, and he did magnesium calcium and faunal proxies for the South Atlantic sea surface temperature and heat transfer. So he then took a huge change and came and joined our group of Bangladesh. Oh, I meant to tell you, he also did some work on primates, but the professor he was working on retired.
Yeah.
So he really has a very diverse background. So when he came and joined our group in Bangladesh, I mean, there was a very steep learning curve, because there we were working on tectonics, sedimentation, monsoons, provenance, and there was a steep learning curve. But he's been involved in several of our abstracts. And the first one was about this earthquake that happened in India, an area called Tripura. It was a magnitude 5.2. It was a strike-slip earthquake, fairly deep, but it caused a tremendous amount of liquefaction. You could find liquefaction for a radius of about 40 kilometers from the epicenter. So that was his first introduction. And then we did have a field campaign and collected some sediments from the northern boundary between India and Bangladesh, and also from a syncline valley associated with the Indo-Burma Ranges. So he's been working very hard, and as I mentioned, a steep learning curve, and he will be working on a 200-meter deep well that we collected in a basin called the Surma Basin. I'm gonna let Robert talk about that. But the title of his proposal is Sediment Provenance and Climate along the Indo-Burma Ranges on Eastern Bangladesh. So welcome, Robert.
Thanks. So let me just do the share screen. So I think everyone can see that. Okay, so thanks for everyone showing up and for letting me talk about this project. So as noted, the title of the project is Sediment Provenance and Climate along the Indo-Burman Ranges for Eastern Bangladesh. And so this is kind of working up to a thesis proposal for myself to present as part of the program at the Graduate Center here at CUNY. So I just want to thank go through some acknowledgements first. So I'd like to thank my committee members, Dr. McHugh, Dr. Smolkas and Alexander, all part of CUNY. A previous student from the Graduate Center, Diman Mandal, did a lot of work in this project also. And also want to thank Drs. Sieber and Dr. Howard, also at CUNY. We've also worked with Drs. Steckler and Goodbreed at LDEO and Vanderbilt. They've given us the most recent set of samples to work on. And some previous CUNY graduate students, Sharif Mustaq helped out a lot in this, and Vitaly Badziai, who's a current student with me in the program, who I see here today, has been helping out with this. This work was supported by an NSF grant and an ONR grant. And in addition to the work that we've done here, there have been students at the University of Dhaka that have done a lot of work. And also some Queen's undergraduate students, Priscilla Tulater and Jaswinder Kaur, they did a lot of the grain size analysis on our first set of samples. And just so that was very helpful and necessary. And so also, it might seem like a smallish thing, but when we originally got the samples, we had to sterilize them. So I just wanted to thank Drs. Andy Jewell and Carol Knudsen at LDEO for helping out with that and allowing us to use their lab and facilities. It was just for a few days, but it was important to be able to do that. And of course, we thank the people of Bangladesh for letting us work on their samples and these materials. So the objectives here are within the scope of this project to get at the late Pleistocene to Holocene sedimentary history of the basin I'm working in, which is the Surma Basin, to understand the effects of eustacy on the entrenchment of the rivers in the region and the building up, the aggradation of the deposits left by them. We want to use eustacy as a tool for obtaining the relative ages and get an idea of the sedimentation rates for the area. And then once we have that, to then use it to model or talk about subsidence in the basin and the tectonic activity of the Dalkey Fault, which I'll explain a little bit, but is part of what has led to the creation of this basin. So for this talk, just as an outline, I want to talk about tectonics, then the modern rivers that are there today, and how they got to that position, then a little bit of background information, and then some of the initial results that we have, and then where I'm trying to go with this in terms of future research. So this is the area that we're working in. And so here, I think you can see a pointer. So this is Bangladesh, okay, the country of Bangladesh. And it's surrounded by India and Burma, Myanmar. And so here is the part of Bangladesh that the Surma Basin is in. To the north, there is something called the Shillong Massif, which is an uplifted block, and the Dalkey Fault, that is the boundary between the basin and this uplifted block. Farther to the north of the Himalayas. And here you can see these hills here. These are the Indo Burma Ranges. So you have collision between the Indian plate, the Asian plate up here, and also the Burma plate, the Burma microplate. And so as they're colliding, you have a convergent boundary here with uplift producing the Himalayas. And then here you have a subductive boundary with the Indian plate. Now this is a cross section going under the Burma plate. And as it's going under, as it's being subducted, the material along the top of the plate is being deformed and built up into these ranges, these Indo-Burman hill ranges, this system of synclines and anticlines. And so here, now back on the big map, you have an area, you have the outermost part of the Indo-Burman ranges, and the anticlines here are actually, they're buried. So at the surface is remarkably flat. But when people have done some seismic surveys, they've been able to still see these anticlines and synclines underneath the surface. So this is the blind part of the front. And then further in, you have the outer part of the fold belt. And here you can see, even in this topographic map, the anticlines and synclines. And then as you move further into the fold belt, you get to the inner part of the belt, then you have this area where the anticlines are at their highest and at their most deformed. And so our area, again, is this part of Bangladesh it's called the Surma Basin. And we have some rivers, a river that we've dug some wells on that passes through this boundary in the outer fold belt. And so it's a river that flows in the synclinal valley, one of the synclinal valleys here. So now just looking at it in a little more detail, this is some work that Steckler and others have done, and including Demon Mondal, who I mentioned earlier, who was a student at the Graduate Center. So here there's oblique subduction. They found that it had around 13 to 17 millimeters per year of convergence between the Indian plate and then the Burma plate. And that Burma microplate, it's a subductive boundary, but it's also one where the plates are rotating past each other. So we have some strike slip faults, and they're also accommodating a lot of the collisional shortening through that movement. And so these different colored lines and different lengths of these lines are the strength of the motion, the amount of motion at these points. And so again, here is our Surma Basin, the Indo-Burma Ranges, and then the Shillong Massif boundary the whole. So now I'm going to talk about the Shillong Massif itself, the Surma Basin, and the paleo rivers that flowed through here. So this is this figure shows progression through time of the evolution of one of the main rivers that influences this area, the Brahmaputra. So first in the late Eocene, you have in red here, I have the Yarlung Zangpo River, and it used to flow into Indochina. And what would be the Paleo Brahmaputra in blue here, and the tributaries for it, flowed off the Himalayas, off the growing Himalayas, and into the area that would become the Surma Basin, and deposited their sediments there. So at this point, right here, it's labeled as the future Shillong Plateau. It hasn't been uplifted yet. And then there would have also been the growing Indo-Burman ranges far to the east, but with some rivers coming off of them and depositing sediments there too. So a few different regions that can potentially influence this area. Now over time, the as the Himalayas are growing and the topography of this whole region is changing as the collision goes on, the Yarlung Zangpo and a part of it called the Siang, and then also the Brahmaputra all merge together. It's usually described as the Brahmaputra capturing the Yarlung Zangpo. So early on, the Brahmaputra was depositing sediments that were derived from the lower Himalayas, but then after time, by the middle and late Miocene, the Brahmaputra is now receiving water and the sediments that these rivers carry from the trans side of the Himalayas, the opposite side of the Himalayas, which have things like parts of the old Tethys Ocean that closed up as the collision went on, that have undergone some extreme metamorphism, and that have a very different set of minerals and a history than the ones on the lower side of the range. So once the Brahmaputra has captured the Yarlung Zangpo, the sediments that it's carrying are completely different, have completely changed from what they were in the past, because they're from different sources. So these sources actually are still at times flowing into the Brahmaputra, but they're completely swamped out by what's happening with the Yarlung Zangpo. And so now the sediments that are being deposited in our Surma Basin are going to have a distinct signature for these trans-Himalayan sources. So we're expecting a provenance change there. Now, over time, going into the Pleistocene, the Shillong Plateau or the Shillong Massif starts rising up in the foreland basin of the Himalayas. So we have this block of crystalline material with sedimentary deposits on top of it that gets lifted up. The sedimentary deposits on top and sedimentary rocks on top get washed off and eroded over time and deposited in our basin. But as this block is rising up, there's a change in the local topography. And so the Brahmaputra now, instead of being able to flow directly into the Surma Basin, meets this topographic high. There's this plateau and also a few other blocks that have risen along with it, and is diverted northwards. And it flows now closer to the Himalayas, between the Himalayan front and between the block. And then it curves around the block and deposits its sediments into the Ganges Brahmaputra Delta that is effectively burying Bangladesh over time. And so there's a little bit of, so this shows a very clear distinction between it depositing material in the Surma Basin and going out of the basin. But there is also an alternate path that it sometimes flows called the Old Brahmaputra, in which you can have some materials from the Brahmaputra deposited close to or in this basin. So this is just a schematic showing the development of these strata over time. And what you're seeing here is, at first, you have just a few strata with shallow, thin deposits close to where the Shillong Plateau will rise up. So the Shillong Plateau is over here, and then you go south into the country. And as that plateau rises up, it causes the basin to start to subside and deflex. And as it does that, it allows more thicker deposits to be placed there. And as those deposits are placed on it, they cause a flexure of the deposits beneath them. So the point here is that there's a big connection between what's happening in the sediments and the development of the basin, and then the tectonics that surround it. And so this is one of the signals that we are hoping to catch. So this is the situation today, where you have the modern rivers of Bangladesh. So here's the Brahmaputra River, and then here is the Ganges. And so the Ganges flows almost exclusively on this side of the Himalayas, but it drains these lower Himalayan materials, and it takes a very long course. So the materials are also very weathered. So deposits from the Ganges are very different from deposits from the Brahmaputra. Now these two rivers eventually meet a confluence, and they join together as something called the Padma River. And then the Padma River is also influenced by a well-known and important river called the Meghna River. And it's between these three that you put down most of the deposits that make up the Ganges Brahmaputra River System Delta, which is shown here. So here again is the Surma Basin, the Shillong Plateau, and it has hundreds of rivers and streams flowing through the basin. The big ones are the Surma and the Kushiara. One of the rivers that we have a series of wells going across is called the Dolai River. It's a trans-boundary river. It crosses from this part of India in the district of Tripura into Bangladesh. And here again are the Indo-Burma Ranges intruding on the whole region. So that earlier field work, so they were able to get these wells using a method called hand percussed well I guess not really drilling, but it's a hand percussed well. And so you're able to get somewhat shallow wells that get good recovery of materials. As they're tapping these pipes, or whether it's bamboo or PVC, they're able to control the flow of material into the pipe. And as material comes out from the top, they record the depth at which they're coming from. And so we end up having our lithological record of what's going on there. So they drilled 10 wells, some 35 to 50 meters deep from across the Dolai River, and then a few other ones from an area called Shillong, which is in the northern side of the basin. And they use GPS RTX to get to precisely get the position of those wells. So here are the anticlines, and here's the syncline that we looked at a few times, but in closer view. And here's a series of wells going across it. And so you can see the old and pass of the Dolai River going through here. So we have these wells going across the whole river valley. And so now this is a figure showing each of those wells, the lithology down the wells. In yellow, we have sand. The bigger the bars, the bigger the grain size of the sand. Then in gray, we have the muds. And then in orange, we have these particular muds that were oxidized and strongly indurated, very hard, and they had a lot of gravel in them. And so here is where the modern riverbed is. And what we think we're seeing over time is the movement of this river through the valley that it's in. And so there are some times where the sands that it's depositing are dominant over here, but other times where there are less, that would correspond to times where like this location is in maybe the floodplain of the river. So we can kind of track the position of this river within its valley using this pretty straightforward method. We also had C14 dates on a lot of this material, on some of this material. And so we're able to confirm that we have the transition from the latest Pleistocene into the Holocene. And that transition shown here at the bottom, it tends to co-occur with those red indurated soils, materials. So we think this is a paleosol, and they're shown here. We think it's from the latest Pleistocene. It tends to occur around 35 meters depth. You can track it across the whole valley. Above that, you have things like early Holocene material, which is around 10 to 7,000 years old. It's a much thicker deposit of sands from 10 to 20 meters. And then when you get into the mid-Holocene and more recent materials in the upper, a few meters of the wells, you have interbedded muds and sand shown here. So that's what it looks like today. Now here is I just wanted to talk a little bit about the sources for the isotopes. So we're using the isotopes in these materials in order to get at the provenance of them. So again, you have the Zangpo, Yarlung, Brahmaputra River here, and it's draining I just want to show it's draining very distinct rocks from this trans-Himalayan side, whereas the Ganges is draining a totally different suite of rocks and has a different sediment load. And then from the Indo Burma Ranges, you also have here in yellow, I'm just showing some like generic rivers coming off it with their own sources. So the Brahmaputra, even though it's draining a huge area, the signal of the material that's in the Brahmaputra is dominated by the trans-Himalayan side. And it's especially dominated by that because of this structure. So this is Nanchi Barwa. It's the eastern syntaxis of the Himalayas. And so you can see it's a very deep gorge and with a lot of topography here. And so what's happening here is that as there's, the river is cutting into the rocks here because it has a very high topography, so it's able to wear away a lot of the rock and material. And so there's a lot of erosion. There's a high amount of precipitation in this area too. And so as you're removing this load of material from these mountains, you're lightening the load, and parts of the crust are able to flow into the area. And as that happens, it starts getting raised up into a higher elevation again. And so you have this kind of feedback, this positive feedback between erosion, the crustal flow, producing more erosion. So there's a huge sediment input that's measured in these that's actually measured in the rivers. It's not just some theoretical thing. And so that sets the signal for the Brahmaputra. So even though it does receive material from the southern side of the Himalayas, it's just all swamped out by especially this part of the trans-Himalayas. So some previous work has been done on the strontium, the 87, 86 strontium isotopes, and then the neodymium isotopes in order to pull apart the provenance of these rivers, of the sediments deposited by these rivers. So McHugh et al. had done some work in 2019 comparing the work done by Singh and Franz Lenord in 2002, where they really established what these isotopic signatures mean and how they get that way. And so they find that you have these trans-Himalayan plutonic belts, which have a relatively high neodymium signal compared to the high Himalayas and lesser Himalayas that is affecting the Ganges, where the values are much more negative. And then in terms of the strontium ratios are very low for the Brahmaputra trans-Himalayan source material, and then they're quite a bit higher for the lesser Himalayas. And so between these two systems, then you can identify the provenance of the sediments. So they compared these results with those of Goodread et al., who had done some work in the same systems in 2014, collecting samples from the modern rivers. So here's one of their figures showing how this system works. So here you have the strontium isotopic ratio and the neodymium ratio. And you're able to distinguish between, say, the Ganges rivers, which have their own, which plot in their own space here, and then the Brahmaputra material, which plots in its own space. And then even some of these tributaries, some of these more local sources coming off the Shillong Plateau and depositing their sediments from that. So you're able to distinguish between this and some other charts, the provenance of these materials. So here is a similar chart, but with our new with our Surma Basin material in focus. So we have Ganges and Brahmaputra River materials that are similar to their modern sources, so they haven't changed over time. We have our Dolai Valley, which is the small river crossing the boundary from the Indo Burma Ranges, showing us a signal that's consistent with the modern Brahmaputra River because it has less of the radiogenic strontium and it has a lower neodymium signal. So they can kind of overlap here, and that's what's shown here, them overlapping. We have our old Brahmaputra River Delta, which is the Brahmaputra sometimes flows into the Surma Basin, or in the past flowed further into the basin. And so that material also had this trans-Himalayan source. And we find some samples that show a mixing of these materials. So possibly things that have been reworked or transported to one area and then brought to another. So there are some that are kind of in between and we can't pull them out as strongly. And then at our Jaflong, our northern sites, we have mafic sources. So the Jaflong materials are shown here, and they plot in their own space because they're mostly coming off of this Shillong Plateau with its own signature. So that's the background. We have a few initial results. So here's that Jaflong. Here are those Jaflong sites again. This is the northern part of the basin. Here you have the plateau, and then the Surma Basin itself. And so from these wells, which are short surface wells, I did some XRD work on them. We have one of these instruments at my campus, so I was luckily able to use it. And so we find that quartz and feldspar are dominant. There's also muscovite and hornblende, but then kaolinite clays are very rare. Here's a stack of the different diffraction patterns going from the top of the well here down with depth. And so we find that there's more diverse mineralogy at the top of these wells. And that as you go deeper into the wells, it becomes much more, you lose a lot of the accessory and minor minerals, and it becomes more quartz dominated or more feldspar dominated, depending on where you are. And especially in terms of the size of the grains, we see the sand size overall tending to dominate as you move down into the well. But there are some times where you have deposits that are put down in the floodplains of the rivers. So you do, of course, find muds at depth through the well. So what we're hoping to do next is here we have, so now this is going to the southern boundary. This is the boundary between India and Bangladesh in yellow. Here we have this blue line is the Dolai River moving through its valley that I showed before, and we have our wells that go across it. And then we obtained a deeper well, a 200-meter deep well at a site called Habiganj. And so what we're doing is right now is the grain size on it. We're going to work on getting the XRD for bulk mineralogy. And then also we're going to use some argon-argon analysis